Tonight's story is called The Whispering Shadows. It was a late hour on a Friday night. The flicker of my lamp, a dim, almost spectral glow, cast long, trembling shadows across the yellowing pages of my books. I was seated in my study, surrounded by the tomes that had become my companions in this dreary task of research. My mind was weary, though the paper I was writing demanded the last fragments of my concentration. How often I had wished for solitude, and tonight the house had granted me such a wish. My family had gone out for the evening, leaving me in silence that should have been tranquil. Should have been. Yes, there was something unnerving in the stillness, something almost preternatural that gripped the air. The house was old, really old, a relic from some forgotten age. Its wooden bones creaked beneath the weight of time, and in that silence I fancied that I heard soft murmurs, faint whispers threading their way through the rotting timbers. It was nothing, I assured myself. If I had long grown accustomed to the startling sounds of the ancient house, then nothing bothered me. The grandfather clock in the hallway told the hour, midnight. I shifted in my chair, my fingers brushing the rough, uneven surface of the manuscript I had been scribbling upon. My mind wandered, a tangle of half-formed thoughts struggling to find resolution. I was nearing the conclusion of my paper, the final argument that would bring coherence to the disjointed ramblings of the past several hours. But inspiration eluded me, teasing the edges of my consciousness like a shadow flitting just out of sight. And then, in that terrible moment of silence, I heard it. A long, low moan. It was as though the very air had given voice to some ancient sorrow rising from the depths of the house itself. I immediately froze, my breath caught in my throat, as if the sound had plucked the strings of some primal fear within me. My heart quickened, a rapid thudding that seemed to echo the pulse of the house. I listened, straining every fiber of my body to catch the faintest hint of a repeat. There it was again, the moan, drawn out, languid and despairing. My hair stood on end, but this time it seemed closer, no longer some distant phantom from the upper floors. My senses sharpened, and I strained to discern the origin of the sound. It seemed to emanate from the corridor, just outside my study. My skin prickled. A sound too deliberate, too human to be the mere creaking of old boards. And then another sound followed, a slow, deliberate shuffling, as if a foot, heavy and weary, was dragging itself towards me. It was then that my blood turned to ice. I rose from the chair with the quietest of motions, my body taut with dread. The lamp flickered in the draught, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with sinister intent. Slowly, I crept to the door of my study, each step an eternity, each breath a laborious task. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the cold brass sending a shiver through my fingers. Not knowing what I might find, I peered around the edge of the door into the dimly lit hallway beyond. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, an abyss from which no light dared escape. Yet, as my eyes adjusted, I seemed to have caught the faintest glimmer of movement. An outline, vague and indistinct, but undeniably there. The footstep, heavy and shuffling, dragged itself once more, and the air thickened with an almost tangible malevolence. I dared not move. My rational mind fought to explain the noise. A draft, perhaps, or a trick of the house's decaying timbers? Yet deep within me, a primal terror slowly clawed its way to the surface, whispering truths I dared not acknowledge. The moan, now unmistakably closer, echoed once more through the house, and with it came the unmistakable sensation that I was not alone. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to move, to shift within the very walls of the house, as though the house itself were alive and breathing. I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, fixed upon me from some unseen vantage. Slowly, with infinite caution, I stepped out into the hallway, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. The floor beneath my feet creaked, a soft protest that seemed to scream through the silence. I could hear the dragging step once more, the faintest scrape of something moving, as if just beyond the edge of perception. With trembling hands, I reached for the light switch, hoping that the harsh glare of electricity would banish whatever nightmare lurked in the shadows. But as my fingers brushed the switch, a cold gust of wind swept down the hallway, extinguishing the flame of my lamp in an instant. I was plunged into darkness. The sudden extinguishing of the lamp seemed to snuff out the very breath from my lungs. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed me. The air was dense with cold, unnatural, as though it were drawn from some place beyond the living world. For what felt like hours, I stood there, my body rigid, my heart thudding in my chest, the echoes of that slow, dragging footstep resonating within my skull. I didn't dare move for fear that even the faintest shuffle of my feet might provoke whatever it was that lurked beyond the veil of shadows, just out of my sight. The house, once a familiar comfort, now felt alien, hostile, as if it had been hollowed out by some unseen force, leaving only a shell of malevolent intent behind. The silence stretched on, oppressive, until I could bear it no longer. I had to know what was out there. I took a deep breath, though it did little to steady my trembling limbs, and fumbled for a match from the small box I kept in my pocket. The tiny spark flared to life, casting a feeble glow that did little to penetrate the surrounding darkness, but it was enough to see the outline of the hallway ahead of me. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow that quivered and flickered in the weak light. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the light's reach, there was a figure. It stood motionless, its form shrouded in a darkness so deep that it seemed to absorb the light itself. I could make out no features, no face, but there was a shape, an outline of something grotesque and twisted. It was tall and hunched over as if its spine had been bent beneath some unseen weight. My breath caught in my throat and the match slipped from my fingers, plunging me once again into the abyss. I could hear the soft hiss as the flame sputtered out on the wooden floor, and with it, the silence returned. I strained my ears, desperate to catch any hint of movement, but there was nothing, only the dreadful stillness. My mind raced, searching for any rational explanation, but the creeping horror in my chest told me that what I had seen was no mere trick of the light. The figure had been real, and it was still there. The dragging sound came again, closer now, impossibly close, as if it were just beyond the door. My hand shook uncontrollably. A wave of nausea swept over me as the air thickened, a sickly, cloying scent filling my nostrils. Something damp, decayed. My hand, trembling violently still, reached for the wall beside me, searching for some anchor in the overwhelming darkness. The house groaned, once more as if it were alive, and with a sudden clarity I realized that I could hear something else. Faint, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. A voice whispering. It was not the familiar murmuring of the wind through the old rafters, nor the creaking of the floorboards beneath the weight of age. No, this was something far more sinister. The voice was low, guttural, as if it belonged to some creature that had long forgotten the sound of human speech. It mumbled in fragments, incoherent but laden, with a dreadful malice that sent chills racing down my spine. I forced myself to listen, straining to make out the words, though some part of me knew I should not. Whatever this thing was not of this world. The words, if they could be called that, were not meant for human ears. Yet, against my better judgment, I found myself listening, drawn by some morbid curiosity. The voice grew louder, closer. The words twisted, forming sounds that made no sense, but their meaning was unmistakable. It wanted something, and it was coming for me. I backed away, slowly at first, and then more quickly, my hand groping for the door behind me. My fingers fumbled with the cold metal of the knob, slick with sweat, until finally, with a desperate twist, the door swung open. I stumbled into the room, slamming the door shut behind me with a loud, resounding thud. And then, for a moment, the silence returned. Suddenly, from the other side of the door, I heard it. The dragging footstep. Closer now, and possibly close, it shuffled toward the door with agonizing slowness. Each step a deliberate, calculated threat. The voice, that dreadful whisper, grew louder, pressing against the thin wooden barrier that separated me from whatever horror lurked beyond the door. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. My eyes darted around the room, searching for some means of defense, but there was nothing. The small study, once a haven of quiet reflection, had become my prison, its walls closing in around me as the thing outside approached. The doorknob rattled. I froze, my heart leaping in my throat. The cold metal twisted slowly, deliberately, as if some unseen hand was testing its strength. A low, guttural moan seeped through the crack beneath the door, and with it came the stench of decay, thick and nauseating. I couldn't bear it any longer, and with a sudden burst of frantic energy, I dashed toward the window. The old warped glass was smeared with years of grime, but I could see the moonlight filtering through, casting a pale glow over the yard outside. My hands clawed frantically at the latch, my fingers trembling so violently that I could scarcely grip it. Finally, with a sharp snap, the window flew open, and the cold night air rushed in, a welcome relief from the oppressive staleness inside. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the door. The knob turned slowly again, this time more forcefully. With a final breath, I threw myself through the window, tumbling into the night. I fell hard onto the damp earth outside, the sharp sting of the fall jolting my entire body. For a moment, I lay there in the cold air, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from the madness. I had just fled. The moon above, pale and distant, cast a thin light over the yard, and the familiar outlines of trees and the withering garden offered some small comfort. That comfort was fleeting. Behind me, the house loomed, its dark silhouette cut against the night sky, as if the structure itself had been carved from the shadows. Its windows, those empty, hollow eyes, seemed to follow my every move, watching with a quiet malice and waiting. Then I heard it again, the whispering. At first it was faint, like the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But no wind stirred this night. The air was thick and still, suffocating. Slowly the sound grew, rising from the depths of the house, creeping through the cracks in the walls and curling around my mind like a cold, bony hand. This was no ordinary presence. There was a deep, ancient malice in it, as though the thing that inhabited the house had existed long before the walls had been erected, before even the land itself had known the footsteps of men. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and backed away from the house, my eyes fixed on the dark windows. It was then that I realized something terrible. The figure, standing in the window, staring down at me. I blinked, disbelief freezing my blood cold. But there it was, its outline, sharp and stark against the glass. It was not moving, just watching. The form was twisted, its limbs contorted in a way that defied the natural order, like something that had been broken and reassembled by a cruel hand. A wave of nausea hit me, and I swayed momentarily, as I understood that it was not just a figment of my imagination. The thing, this entity, had form, but it was more than a mere apparition. There was something far worse beneath its presence, a power that seemed to vibrate within the very earth beneath my feet, and I knew I was not the first to encounter it. The whispers grew louder, each word now clearer, though still indecipherable. The voice no longer seemed human, if it ever had been. It was something far older, far darker. The language it spoke was alien, its symbols harsh and guttural, yet laced with a mocking cadence, as though the thing took pleasure in my terror. I tried to focus to understand what it was saying, but the meaning slipped away from me like smoke. Yet the intent was unmistakable. It was calling me. As I stood there, rooted to the spot, I felt an overwhelming pull, like a magnetic force that seemed to drag me towards the house, inexorably looming larger and larger. My feet moved of their own accord as though some invisible chain had wrapped around my limbs, pulling me back into the very heart of the terror I had just escaped. I fought viciously, my mind screaming against the unseen force, but with each step closer to the house, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I began to feel something else, a presence, pushing against the edges of my consciousness. It was as though the thing in the house was not just watching, but entering me, creeping into the darkest corners of my mind, searching for something, some hidden door through which it could slip. And suddenly a memory surfaced, unbidden from the depths of my mind. I had heard stories about this house. Whispered rumors passed around the town, though I had never given them any credence. It had been said that long ago, before my family had come to live here, the land had been cursed, and something had happened in this place, something so horrific that the very earth had become tainted. The house itself had been built over the remains of an older structure, a place of strange rituals and blood sacrifices. I dismissed these tales as mere superstition, the ramblings of the ignorant and fearful. But now, as the entity pulled at the threads of my mind, I began to see the house, my home, was more than just old and creaking. It was a vessel, a prison for something ancient and evil, something that had been bound here long ago, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now it had found me. The figure in the window moved, its grotesque form slithering away from the glass, disappearing into the blackness within. But the whispers did not fade. They grew louder, stronger, until there was a cacophony of voices, a rising storm of madness that pounded against my skull. I staggered backward, clutching my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside me now, swirling around in my head, filling every crevice with their dark intent. Come back, the voice seemed to say, clearer now, the words twisting with a dreadful hunger. You cannot escape. We are bound. We are one. The voice was no longer a distant whisper, but something far more personal, far more intimate, as though it had always been part of me, lying dormant, waiting for this very moment to awaken. And then I felt it. A cold hand, not physical but mental, reaching into my soul, pulling at my very essence. The thing in the house, the entity that had watched me from the shadows, was no mere ghost. It was feeding on me, drawing strength from my fear and my despair. I stumbled, my vision blurring as the world around me tilted and spun. The house loomed larger, its windows now black, soulless pits, their very walls seeming to writhe as though alive. The whispers were all around me now, inside me, a swirling torrent of madness that threatened to consume me whole. But then amidst the cacophony I heard something else, a voice, faint and fragile, cutting through the darkness. It was not like the others. It was calm, soft, and, well, almost pleading. Leave this place, it said. You must leave before it's too late. I blinked, my head spinning. The voice was different. It felt, well, human. It felt familiar. I glanced back at the house. The monstrous shape of it twisted in the moonlight, and something within me snapped. The thing inside me was ancient, yes, but it was also trapped. The rituals that had bound it here had kept it imprisoned, unable to fully enter our world. That's why it needed me. It needed someone to free it. It needed a mind to latch onto, a body to inhabit. I understood then what the house had been doing all these years, drawing people in, feeding off their fear and searching for the perfect host. And now it had found me. But the voice, the human voice, was right. There was still time. I could still escape. If I stayed, the thing in the house would take me, devour me, and be free to wreak havoc and terror on the world beyond. I turned and ran, the cold night air biting at my face as I sprinted across the yard. Behind me, the house seemed to groan in fury, the walls shuddering as though the very structure were alive. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but I didn't stop. I could feel the presence reaching for me, clawing at the edges of my mind. But I pushed it away, focusing on the one thing that mattered. Escape. I would not be its prisoner. Not tonight.